add value to your business, or do you want to just be this administrative person?
And often, if you look at your talent team and the caliber of talent in your company, they correlate.
You could hire the best person for the job if they were in your candidate pool.
All these individual employees, one by one, together, their voices all come together to articulate the culture of the company.
This is hiring.
Hiring on all cylinders.
Hello again, my sweet, wonderful, talented recruiting pros. Rob Stevenson here, once more at the helm of Hiring on All Cylinders, and we shall surge forth with undaunted resolution to deliver you another classic installment of your favorite recruiting podcast. I am joined on my left by the Intello head of talent, Mrs. Britt Ryan. Britt, how are you?
I'm great, Rob. How are you?
Wonderful. I feel like it's been a while since you were in here.
It has been a while.
It's good to have you back. Get the band back together.
That's right. Good to be back.
Definitely I have a bunch of questions for you about what's going on in the Intello talent machine. But first, I don't want to let our awesome guest just sit idly waiting in the wings. So today I am joined by a colleague of a recent podcast guest, co-founder, longtime recruiter for Advantis and Google also, now on the talent team over at Lightspeed Ventures, Cat Surane. So wonderful to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So you are a colleague of recent guest Luke Bessida, who after his appearance confessed that you were both the brains and brawn of the Lightspeed talent operation. So naturally had to have you in. So I guess let's just do our best to blow his episode out of the water.
Awesome. We're competitive with each other, so that sounds great.
Good, yeah. Who had the better podcast episode? Only time will tell.
Exactly.
So Kat, definitely chime in as much as you like here. Britt, do you want to just kind of catch us up on what's going on in the Intello recruiting world?
Yeah, sure. There is so much going on. We are just jamming into Q2, so we had a great Q1, was really excited about that. We started off Q2 this past Monday with Wolf Grand, who joined us, running our enterprise sales organization.
Big hire.
Yes, it was a big hire for us. So hats off to Amina, who is traveling and taking some PTO after working hard to fill that one. So we're very excited to have Wolf here, and we actually spent time doing a recruiting on-site a couple weeks ago. So I've actually been here for 6 months now.
How about that?
I know. Time flies. And so we spent some time as a team kind of going through what we've accomplished and what we feel really good about and what we want to add into the mix, some stuff that we haven't done yet, and some stuff that we kind of hit the pause button on because at the end of the day, we're here to fill jobs. And so all of the other stuff like having awesome job descriptions and having great video content are all things that are really, really important, but not as important as finding the right people for the jobs that your hiring managers need you to fill. So we've been super busy.
So are those couple of things you mentioned, are those the things you want to add into the mix, or?
Yeah, so ironically, I just finished a webcast earlier today with Glassdoor about writing great job descriptions. And so one of the things that we'd been talking about was updating our job descriptions. And so it really lit a fire under me this week where I was like, all right, we need to get our job descriptions updated before this webcast so that as people are hearing about Intello and looking at our website that they say, wow, they really do walk the walk. So
yeah, exactly.
That's one of the things that we've gotten done. And
if I was on that webinar, that'd be the first thing I did. It would be to be like, Britt Ryan's talking about job descriptions. Who is she? Let's go read some of these so-called job descriptions and see what's up.
It's funny.
Do they have any suggestions around how to make the job descriptions better? I know that especially for diversity recruiting, it's important not to have words like ninja and, words that are a little bit charged. Yeah. I don't know if they gave any kind of suggestions like that.
So we actually talked about that, avoiding the superstar, ninja, dynamo, whatever, guru. And it's important for diversity. It's also important for job titles. So when you think about how people look for jobs and titles that they look for, what are the ones that are optimized to be found? So another good reason there. We talked a lot about kind of similar to diversity, and when you talk about inclusion, about keeping your job descriptions neutral. So at Intello, we use a decoder where we can put our job descriptions into that, and it will let us know if they're heavily biased in towards a male audience or towards a female audience, and how we can make them more neutral. Another thing that I personally feel very strongly about, and you can go to our career site and check, but all of our job descriptions, rather than sort of going the old-fashioned way of roles and responsibilities, we talk about what you will be doing here and what you've done. So making them very much directed towards the person as opposed to about the company. So it was great. Yeah.
When you run job descriptions through that tool, I guess in lieu of using a tool, what are some of those things that it picks up on where, oh, this job description leans masculine? I don't know, this is probably a bad example, but like if you use something that's like an overt sports reference or just like something, is that like one of the things it looks for? How does it try and normalize job descriptions so that they appeal to people equally?
Yeah, so this is more about gender, more he and she, and trying to use
pronouns,
they
okay.
and them more often. And I will say Gender Decoder, which is the website we use, is free, so definitely geared more towards the startup audience that's working on more of a shoestring budget. There are other tools out there that will actually like rewrite your job descriptions for you to make sure that they're neutral. But you also want to be thoughtful about things of like, we're looking for an athlete, or, we are a highly competitive company, work hard, play hard. Those are all things that are geared towards a male audience. So also really important to think about the hiring manager and who's writing the job description, because they'll sometimes lean more towards what's akin to them, where if you wrote a job description and used words like we're looking for somebody who's compassionate and thoughtful, that would be, more appealing to a woman.
You mentioned hiring managers, and this is a complete like aside, but I was thinking about this today, and I made a point I wanted to ask you both. So recruiters have this complicated relationship with hiring managers. Often, like on a bunch of different episodes, we've talked about how you have to manage their expectations as a recruiter. You have to go back to them to the job description and be like, hey, these things are not actual must-haves, or maybe you're bringing candidates that agree with that and they're still saying no. So I guess, do recruiters hate hiring managers? Is it the kind of thing that when it's just a bunch of recruiters, like, so then the hiring manager and someone else is like, oh, I know how that goes? Or is it like a more cooperative relationship?
Kat?
So I can jump in there. So, I personally have never hated a hiring manager. I don't necessarily know that sentiment is something that recruiters feel. I do think that sometimes it's managing expectations appropriately. So this actually kind of brought up in my mind the sticky note exercise that we do with some of our companies. We've done it with some of our founders of, you want to hire the essentially better version of yourself. A lot of times they're that unicorn person that might not actually exist. So what we do with our companies, and we encourage our recruiters to do this with their hiring managers, is have everyone that's involved in the hiring process sit in a room for 5 minutes. Everyone gets 3 sticky notes that are for technical skills, and then 1 to 2 sticky notes for a soft skill. And everyone gets to write down what they think is required for that role, put them up on the board, and you can very quickly see that, okay, we all have very different views of who this person is, and we can't have all of these different skills. So let's go back and build a profile that's actually realistic. I think doing those different exercises can help you have a little bit of a better working relationship with the hiring manager, because they only know, what they've been told and what they've experienced. So if they've not been told, hey, we can't find this unicorn person, they're going to continue to push for something that's probably not realistic.
Right. That sounds like an awesome exercise also, because it helps pare down what the necessary traits are. So it's very easy when you're writing a job description to just be like, this, and enter a bullet point, enter, and like do like 9 or 10, as opposed to if you get just a handful, and then once you put it on the board, then you can also start taking some off and then sort of as a group figure it out, instead of, is the normal process like hiring manager lists off traits, recruiter edits it, writes it? Is that kind of how it normally goes?
For me, it is. I love what you're doing, Kat, because I think it helps you to also see common themes. So I love that we do something similar here, where we'll get everyone from the hiring team in a room to discuss the job, but we might need to steal that sticky note idea. In terms of writing the job description, I personally am a real stickler for it being the hiring manager's job, where I am here to help you. If you have career ladders built out, you should be using those. You should be partnering with your HR business partner. But this is really your hire. So you need to go out and think about, what is this person going to be doing every day, and what do you really need in terms of qualifications for this person to be successful. And once that's done, then I have myself or another recruiter sit down with the hiring manager to actually kick off the search and start to poke holes in the job description and have that conversation of back and forth around what's important and what's not. But if the hiring manager isn't invested enough to write the job description, then that's one of those things that could cause great frustration to the recruiter and perhaps have them, talking with their peer group about how frustrating that hiring manager is.
So to answer my question, recruiters don't hate hiring managers as much as they get considerably frustrated with them from time to time.
Exactly.
Working relationship.
Yep.
Exactly. That's a good way to put it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So forgive my ignorance. What's a career ladder?
So a career ladder is something we've actually developed one for our engineering group. And it basically will tell somebody what the level of experience is and what you're doing in the job. So if I'm an engineer at Intello and I come in with 2 years experience as a software engineer, and my goal is to become a senior software engineer, what are the things that I need to accomplish in my time here in order to reach that goal of being a senior software engineer? So, and then it goes on from there to be a lead and a principal or manager or director. So it's usually something that's done like in an Excel spreadsheet, and there are little boxes along the way that kind of go, give you the details that you need. And you can do that for any group. We're actually building one on the recruiting team now that goes from coordinator to sourcer to recruiter, senior recruiter, lead recruiter, recruiting manager.
And Britt, question there. So is that communicated outside of just for hiring managers? Is that communicated across the company of what the steps are that are required to become, whatever the next level might be?
Yeah, we do communicate it publicly here. And we've also shared it with candidates. So sometimes if we have a candidate and we're internally struggling, let's say, between bringing them in as, a software engineer or a senior, and if we ultimately decide we're going to bring you in as a software engineer, but we want you to understand that we're real when we say we're going to promote you within 6 months based on performance, we'll also share the career ladder with a candidate to say, just so you know, here are the areas where we have a couple of concerns or we see, an opportunity for you to develop. And once we've seen those in action, we'll promote you into that next level role.
Awesome. I'd imagine that helps a ton with attrition and internal mobility and keeping people really engaged.
Yeah, exactly. Like retention, people know that there's a plan for them. It's not just like, well, we'll promote you at some point.
Exactly. And I think, it's easy to kind of think when I'm at a small company, we're really flat. We don't have tons of layers and levels like you would at a public large company. But you still want to feel like you're moving forward in your career and you have options. And, you can have those conversations with your manager of, I feel like I've done really great things and I'm benchmarking well against my peers. How do I move to the next level? So I think that's awesome that you guys communicate that.
Yeah, it's a great thing to have. And I know even for somebody who is in a leadership role, to have that as a guideline around how to communicate and how to have those conversations around, what current performance looks like and what's required in terms of future performance in order to, achieve that growth.
Kat, is that something that you've coached hiring managers on in terms of knowing where this role goes long term?
Yeah, and I think it's something that we try and really communicate to our founders, our recruiting team, our hiring managers, that it's more expensive to hire a new person than it is to retain an existing person.
Totally,
and that existing person, has helped you build the company to where you are now. You want to make sure that you're putting things in place to keep them. I think that there's a lot that goes into that. Having regular one-on-ones, teaching new managers how to actually, do performance reviews effectively, or coach a employee that maybe needs a little bit of help in certain areas. Those are difficult conversations, but even clearly communicating what the path to career growth within the company is a huge thing. I think transparency as much as possible helps tremendously with attrition.
Definitely. it's really interesting that that specifically tends to be the role of a recruiter. And it speaks to this bigger trend, or maybe it's not a trend, and maybe I'm just learning about it for the first time. But it seems like, so recruiters recruit, right? Like you're supposed to find people, build quality pipeline, pass them on to the hiring manager and the individual contributors, and hopefully they hire them, right? And then if you get hires made, can be like your ultimate KPI. Fine. But doesn't end there. It doesn't end with that person's first day. You see these recruiters who are like, well, guess what? If this person doesn't stick around here, if they're not in a good situation, then I'm going to be hiring for this role again, and this team is going to miss their goals. So now you're not just a recruiter. You have to be focused on talent development as a recruiter. Would you agree, Kat? Do you think that recruiters need to be focused on the lifetime of their candidates as opposed to just when they get hired?
Definitely. And I think that people operations is a newer term for good reason. So it encompasses HR, recruiting, and pretty much everything that goes into the talent process. The earlier the company is, I think the more whether they're one recruiter or a small team has to take on those HR-esque responsibilities, encouraging hiring managers to have one-on-ones with their team, figuring out how do we actually level people appropriately. If we need to set salary bands, what do those look like, and who do we need to talk to get that figured out? And then as the companies grow, we've more and more seen that recruiting has kept a lot of those functions. So interview training, working on manager growth in general, figuring out internal mobility programs, managing the entire employee referral process, things that at big companies are not traditionally under the recruiting function. Right. I think that it just kind of makes sense in the startup world that recruiters are that almost like account managers that are working so closely with the hiring managers. They know very deeply what that team needs to succeed. So recruiting taking that on, I think, makes a lot of sense.
Definitely. And so, yeah, it's, I guess, end of the day, it's a, air quotes, people ops responsibility, but are a lot of talent teams structured that way early on?
So I would say that, especially for recruiters that have not been in an early stage startup before, I find that that's something that's a little bit jarring of, oh, wow, I didn't know that I had to be a recruiter, the HR leader, and our head cheerleader and office manager and coordinator and everything under the sun. But that's really what it comes down to make, the company succeed and your individual teams successful. So making sure that you are the one that's there to greet all of the new incoming interviewees, make sure that their desk is set up on their first day, making sure that they're having a good onboarding process, meeting with their hiring managers one-on-one, making sure they have a buddy when they first start. All of those different things that usually get split up amongst large teams are put on 1 to maybe 5 people in an early stage company.
Man, recruiters.
I know.
Recruiters are salespeople. Recruiters are marketers. Recruiters as analysts. Recruiters as coordinators, administrative. It never ends for you people.
Yeah, the jack of all trades.
Exactly.
Rob, you mentioned one thing too about metrics, which I think is really interesting because we've started this year measuring quality of hire. So, when you were talking about sort of that's the goal for the recruiter is to get this person hired and onboarded. But to your point, it's way more costly to have somebody on board and off board within a 3 to 6 month period. So one of the things that we really focus on is not just how many recs are filled or how quickly we're filling them, but what's the quality of hire. And that's something that we do by measuring success through the hiring manager and really looking at performance once they're on board. And that is completely and totally the responsibility of the recruiter to drive and make sure that we're, hiring for a good quality hire as well.
And how long do you measure that for? So Luke and I have had back and forth conversations with companies about, once someone's been on board for, let's say, 6 months, is it now the recruiter's, responsibility of if they were a good hire or maybe not as good of a hire, or does that fall onto the hiring manager of, are you good at fostering their growth and, integrating them into the greater team?
Yeah, so I think it's somewhere between that 90 and 180 days. So we survey after the first 4 weeks, and then we survey again of the hiring managers. at 3 months. One of the things that I love to do, and we're not quite that established here at Intello, but I'm very much looking forward to us getting something in like a Reflective or a Better Works, because then you really get away from this whole performance review idea. And at my last company, we used Culture Amp we used Culture Amp, and I loved being able to really use that for where I drew my metrics around quality of hire, because you can look at somebody's performance over a longer period of time. But with us, using a SurveyMonkey type tool, we're much more focused on, did this person onboard and are they what we expected them to be based on how we interviewed them through our process.
Yeah, I think the earlier that you can, obviously they cost money, but the earlier you can get those types of platforms and systems in place, the better. Obviously, I'm a little biased. Reflective is one of our companies, and I can't speak highly enough about their team, but any of those systems, I think the earlier the better you can get them in place.
Yep.
What does Reflective do?
So Reflective is a performance management tool that's a little bit like Slack, where it's real time. You can give people thumbs up, you can give them feedback. So rather than at the end of the year where you go to your performance review and you kind of are worried about, I think I did good this year, but I can't really remember all of the awesome things I did. There's a log of all of the different, reviews that you accumulated over the year. So there's no kind of worry or stress going into
shock,
that. Or shock going into that meeting.
Gotcha. That was a pretty good elevator pitch.
Well, thank you.
You didn't say performance management.
Hopefully I talked about them correctly.
Yeah. You didn't say performance management is broken, so I'm sure they'll appreciate that.
They fixed it.
They fixed it.
Finally,
Exactly. They fixed it.
What are some metrics, while we're on the topic, Kat, that you like to have talent teams focus on, or that you say, hey, this is going to really help you scale and grow your talent team?
Yeah, so in that talent trend survey that we did, one of the interesting findings that, at least for me, was that across all stages, sourcers were held to 4 hires per quarter, and technical recruiters were held to about 5 to 6. So when you're looking at that, that's actually not very many. I think a lot of times, especially for non-recruiters, you think, oh, well, they can hire 20 people per quarter, 30 people per quarter. I've heard that regularly.
That's insane.
Which, that sounds like a huge number when you take it back to, 5 to 6. But even backing that out into, 5 to 6, what work actually goes into that based off of our current process that we have, and then even based off of human elements. So how many people am I actually capable of reaching out to per day, per week? And how does that kind of trend over time? If you're not tracking that, can I reach out to 100 people per week, 300 people per week? I've heard a variety of different kind of numbers there, but unless you're personally tracking that and tracking that across a team, you can't really accurately benchmark of how many people can we actually hire in a quarter or a year. So that's one of the number one things from a sourcing perspective that I really encourage our teams to track. How many people do you actually reach out to in a week? There's a really simple Chrome extension that you can add in. It's like literally a tally button that I did for a while, where every single time I reached out to someone, I just clicked the button. Okay, great. This week I got X number, of reach outs. Next week, let's see if I benchmark against that. Similarly.
Right. And that's just top of the funnel, right? Now It's like once you have your bulk outreach, then you should know your response rates and like how likely those people are to want to take a phone call, come to onsite. And so to your point, like that informs not just your team's ability, but also when you talk about talent having a seat at the table, like you should be able, when you say, hey, we can hire this many people, like our headcount goals have to reflect the bandwidth of the actual team. Here's the bandwidth of the actual team.
Well, and Britt, you've probably experienced this as head of talent, where you go and you're talking to your C-levels and saying, hey, we need to hire another person or we're not going to hit our hiring goals. And if you can't tell them why you need to hire another person, backing that up with numbers, that conversation is very difficult.
Yep, absolutely. It's without question. Yeah, I was smiling and nodding my head here with Kat, but have very much had those conversations. I think it's one of the things that we see recruiting teams struggle with, whether it's startups or, recently I was at a dinner in New York talking with heads of talent from American Express and Wells Fargo and AIG. And believe it or not, their problems are the exact same, which is how do I get the right team for myself as a recruitment leader in order to meet the hiring goals of the business. And that it's, I think for so many people, recruiting is seen as a non-revenue generating function. And so you're not always getting the dollars and cents that you need to staff your team. So how you're being creative and how you're using data to tell that story is absolutely critical.
Definitely.
When you say that talent isn't looked as a revenue generating arm of the business, it is, though, because if you don't hire that salesperson, then that's all that salesperson's quota that's not getting filled.
But you were enlightened, Rob.
Right. I am not your average C-level exec. But so then I guess when you're making that argument at that level, do you need to put it in terms of like the opportunity cost of not hiring and being like, hey, we need to hire this many salespeople, and if we don't hire them, they're not going to hit their goals. Here's a number for you. The sales that aren't getting closed because we didn't hire those sales reps. Is that part of the responsibilities of someone like in your role, Britt?
Absolutely. And it's very much thinking with the business in mind. So, one of my closest C-level partners, quite honestly, is the CFO. And having the conversations around if we need to have X amount of people on board to hit a certain sales number in Q4, then we also need to back out of that and think, how long does it take a salesperson to ramp? So when do we actually need to have these people hired by? So in order for the company to meet their goals, their revenue goals for the year, recruiting's thinking about that anywhere from 6 to 18 months out about what that's going to look like. So.
Well, that's good. Good to know that you're fighting the good fight at the C level. I've never heard that like the CFO needs to be the most strategic partner. That I would guess like it would be the VP of talent or maybe even like whatever hiring manager has like the most roles. But it's interesting to know that you're like going straight to the books.
Yeah. And it's funny because Jill even wrote a blog post about this, Jill Whitty, who runs our talent organization. But it's really having the close relationship with finance. And, even when I've worked at much larger enterprise organizations, I always tell people, one of the reasons that I ultimately left Salesforce is because I spent every single day in finance with a spreadsheet talking about where are you against your hiring goals, and based on when people are coming in, when spend goes out of the company. So there's a big difference if you hire somebody the first day of the quarter or the last day of the quarter. And sort of, there are just so many things that go into that. And when you're really trying to manage to a certain budget number within a department, those are all things you need to be very conscientious of.
Definitely. The title of this episode is going to be Buddying Up the Bean Counters. Britt Ryan's guide for befriending the CFO and making all your hiring dreams come true. Kat, you said you recently, or was it today or this week, did a sourcing training on site?
Yesterday, actually. But yeah, so very top of mind. That's something that so a little bit of context about how this got started. At Google, I got really interested in training. I actually helped build out our onboarding process for all new recruiters, sourcers, and basically everyone in kind of the recruiting-esque function, so coordinators, all of that. So I got to train all of the new folks coming in every single week, which was really exciting. And it was something when I came over to Lightspeed, I noticed that not only do startups not have learning and development programs or any kind of ongoing, whether it be onboarding or just ongoing support for recruiters, but even big companies don't have that. And they definitely don't have anything for those outside of the recruiting function. So hiring managers or, founders trying to figure out, how do I hire by myself? So I thought, I've got this knowledge. Why don't I write it down and see if I can communicate it to the masses? So gone into several of our companies at this point, ranging from, one person, founders to they're trying to figure out how they can source by themselves and not have to pay for a LinkedIn recruiter and all of the expensive tools, to some of our bigger teams with 30 plus recruiters that, they've hired all these amazing people, but how do they kind of take it to the next level of how do I get outside of LinkedIn Recruiter, or we don't have enough money to pay for, a seat in all of these different recruiting resources. How do we find emails, all those different things? So I'll sit down with them and kind of figure out what is the linchpin here to kind of help them. And let's talk through some different strategies that they can use to be a little bit more effective.
Gotcha. So you created and led this training platform for all of Google's starting recruiters?
So with help, obviously,
Right.
Google is a big company, but yes, I helped create that recruiting onboarding process, essentially.
Folks, this is called burying the lead. And if I was a better interviewer, we would have started with this. That's really, really interesting. Side note, do you know Marvin Stickle?
I do. I know Marvin well.
Really?
Marvin's awesome.
Did you work together at Google?
We did, yeah.
So Marvin, like that.
He's at Pandora now, right?
Right. He just got promoted, director of recruiting.
That's exciting.
He found or started that like Google's first D&I recruiting task force. Did you like work with them in coordination with that, or did you guys have a partnership back in the day?
Yeah, so Marvin obviously working on technical diversity hiring for Google, and he built out an amazing team that I partnered with pretty closely. So my background at Google on the sourcing team for enterprise, everything enterprise tech, and that was something that we noticed very quickly, that we had some sticking points with hiring in technical diversity candidates. So I partnered with him very closely on how can we, be really forward thinking, how can we work with hiring managers to make sure that we're setting them up for success. Even simple things like we had a amazing female engineer coming in, and her entire interview panel were men. And she actually came back to me and she said, I love the team, but it was a little bit unsettling to me that I only met with men throughout this entire process. Even the person who walked me into the interview was a man. Like, do you guys hire women here? I'm a little bit concerned about it. So thinking through even basic things like that I think can be very easily overlooked are important. And Marvin was absolutely huge in that at Google.
Cool. So was that part of the recruiting training process, like even just assembling interviewing teams?
Yeah, so assembling interviewing teams, how to do that effectively, how to identify who's good at interviewing and who's not, Google had a absolutely amazing database of candidates. I think most people who are looking for a job have applied to Google at some point. So a big thing for us when I was there was, how do you actually mine that database effectively? I think that's something that even at startups, I notice people forget about, that you do get a lot of inbound applicants, and they might not be a fit when you're 50 people, but when you're 200 people, that person might be a really awesome fit. So why don't you go back into your ATS and actually look them up and take some time to do that? I think a lot of it is not rocket science. It's just bringing that back up to mind that, this is something that's important and we should be taking time out of our day to do it. And I think from a sourcing perspective, I find that you do have to set time on your calendar to actually sit down and do those searches, and, even sit down and search through, whether it be Intello or LinkedIn Recruiter or whatever it might be. You actually have to set time on your calendar to do that.
I'll edit out LinkedIn Recruiter later, but I had a follow-up question on every like bullet point you said there. How do you tell if someone's a bad interviewer?
Yeah, so I think that one, it's important to elicit feedback from your candidates, and you can do that pretty organically. Of hey, how'd you feel the interview went? We're really excited about you. Or maybe if you're not, letting them down in an easy fashion and actually talking to them on the phone. I think that's something that it's a huge missed opportunity when you just send out the email of, hey, it didn't really work out this time. We'd love for you to interview in the future. Even letting them down easy over email is a missed opportunity, because that's when you hear about, oh, my interviewer was late, or they said something that made me uneasy, or whatever it might be. Those are teaching moments for the interviewer. And then if enough of those accumulate, I think that's when it's maybe, hey, let's take you aside, put you into a shadowing program, and then after that, we can put you back into the interviewing force.
Right.
I think there's ways to kind of identify that. I don't know that there's one easy way to say, oh, this person's a really hard interviewer. It doesn't mean that they're a bad interviewer.
Right.
So I think that's an important kind of distinction.
Right. Because even if they're giving a thumbs down on a candidate that everyone else, or candidates that everyone else likes, that could just be the area they're assessing for. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad at it or they're too hard, right?
Exactly. And in an ideal interview process, every person has a specific area they're assessing for, that they are a expert in. So you wouldn't have someone assessing for algorithms that doesn't code. That wouldn't make any sense. And then you probably wouldn't have someone who maybe doesn't like public speaking assess for a presentation. It doesn't really make sense in that process. So I think it's contextually taking, their recommendation of maybe it wasn't your job to assess for cultural fit and you're not giving any kind of background on why you don't think they're a cultural fit, maybe we throw that out in terms of kind of interview scoring. But if that's something that's core to what they're actually supposed to be interviewing for, I would take that as, they're the expert. We're going to go with their score, even if it's kind of difficult for this particular candidate.
So then before you would toss someone off the interviewing squad, you would do stuff like you said, put them on a panel or like have them in a group interview with other people who are good interviewers, or how do you do that delicately?
Yeah, so I always recommend before people even start interviewing is have them shadow an experienced interviewer. I think in an ideal world, I would recommend doing at least 3 shadows. That's not always possible, especially if you have a really lean team, but at least doing one where they sit in with an experienced interviewer. You obviously have to tell the candidate, hey, I'm going to sit in here, like I'm learning how to interview, or however you want to position it. So there's not some random person sitting in the corner. But they should be taking notes. They should be scoring the candidate as they would if they were actually the lead interviewer. And then comparing those notes to what the main interviewer came back with and saying, okay, are they kind of on the same page? If they're not, why? And then training them on how they can be, where areas that they can improve. And then if I were to identify someone that was really struggling interviewing people, it might be just transitioning what their focus area is on. Maybe it's something that they don't feel comfortable asking those questions. Maybe the question banks are not built out enough to make them feel comfortable of, here are the 3 different things that you can ask, and you don't have to think outside of that. I think one of the things that I've found with our companies and when I was at Google as well is interviewing is stressful for candidates as well as the interviewer or interviewer. Yes.
Yep.
It's a stressful situation for both sides. You're talking to someone you don't know about a very specific topic, and you're not exactly sure what you're going to be asked from, the candidate side or from the interviewer side.
Right.
So I think taking that into account and trying to minimize the amount of abstract thinking that you might have to do and saying, these are the questions that we ask, these are the answers that are right and maybe not as right or, wrong, and empowering them with that information. I find most people can be pretty good interviewers if you empower them with the right information.
Right. So you just close there with saying, given the right tools and coaching, anyone can really interview. At what point do you go, listen, Rob, you're a great content marketer, but you're just the worst interviewer on the planet. Like you're done. Like we're not going to put you on any more interviewing squads.
So I think that's probably something from your manager's perspective, that it should be coming from your manager. I think in most companies, becoming an interviewer is something that's actually important to moving forward in your career. Because when you are a hiring manager, you're going to have to interview people. It might be something that in that part of your career, it's just not interesting to you, or you don't, maybe you don't have the time to commit to learning the interview questions or whatever it might be. I think that's something that's best communicated from the manager down rather than from a recruiter across. So if I was the recruiter, I would go to the manager and say, hey, here's some background on why we're struggling here. We've tried to improve in these different areas. I'm going to default to you to make the best assessment on how we should move forward. But I probably wouldn't recommend a recruiter go and say, hey, you suck at interviewing. We're taking you out of the equation here. I find that's kind of sticky ground, I would say.
I was being facetious. I guess some teams might be hamstrung because you only have so many. If you're a small team, you only have so many people who it even makes sense to interview. But at Google, it's 80,000 person company, right? Like there's no dearth of options there. So would it make sense to kind of have rotating teams, or would you pick your main people and stick with them?
I think every team functioned differently there, where some teams had rotating panels and a lot of the process was automated. So when you would set up an interview, it would help you select who was available schedule-wise to actually interview that person. At startups, that's definitely not the case. So
that's a handy tool.
Yes,
was
very
it
nice.
Something Google built?
It was their G-Hire ATS had that all kind of built in, which was pretty nice.
That's super badass.
Yes.
I just know there's probably a ton of recruiting coordinators and like recruiters who are just like, oh my God, that would change my life if you didn't have to like do all the scheduling.
Preset interview panels and all that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's definitely nice. On the startup side, you've got, only the people that are sitting around you to actually do the interviews.
Right.
And a lot of times they're completely time strapped. They might be out of the office if they're sales reps or, whoever it might be. So I find a lot of times coaching is paramount to making sure that you have good interview outcomes, because you can't just say, okay, well, you're not that great at interviewing right now, so we're just not going to use you, because you don't have anyone else to rely on for assessing that skill set. So that's where I think it goes back to the recruiter, to be very mindful of how can I make sure that I'm training the team as effectively as possible. And when we are hitting stumbling blocks, maybe that is me sitting down with the manager and saying, let's build out actual questions, whether they be for the technical assessment or even, they're sitting there and they don't know, can they ask someone how their weekend was? I shouldn't be asking someone about their family because that has legal implications and all that kind of stuff. People get really stressed out about it.
Right.
So as a recruiter, writing that stuff down and empowering someone with basically a cheat sheet of information they can use when they get nervous, I think is huge.
You make some great points there. I think it's really interesting too, if you think about startups, and we did this when I came in at Intello, was that we set up interview training, and we're actually certifying interviewers. So they're going through a 2-part training. One is, in the conference room with the slides, and you go through everything around, how does a great interview go? How do you build rapport? How do you assess for culture? All of that. And then the second step of it, we sit down and we have 2 people in a room with 1 recruiter, and we actually have them go through the process of participating in a culture interview and asking competency-based questions. So, certainly if you are at a much more established company, it's harder. But if you're in, a seat where you're at a startup, by getting everyone trained early, and then we set up quarterly training. So as we have new cohorts come in, we make sure that we're bringing those people into the fold, that they understand how to interview Intello style. So, hopefully you can help people to also, develop those skills and feel comfortable around interviewing.
And have you found that people have gotten a little bit more excited about actually being part of the interview process since you've put this interview training in place?
Yeah. And it's interesting. The group that I just did earlier this week was our SDR team. So we have some people who really have never interviewed, are newer to interviewing, aren't always sure what to ask. And so the feedback that I got from them was just incredible. Like, it made me feel so happy and gave me such great purpose to, have worked with a group of people that really, this was totally new information to them. It wasn't, me sort of rejiggering something that they maybe learned at their last company. And so, kind of to that point of getting people when they're earlier in their career and they're just starting to interview, and being able to just nab them right away and have them go through interview training is so valuable.
And do you guys set up question banks that are pre-prepared before you actually start interviewing candidates?
Yeah, so we do have question banks. So we have a wiki here, and we have general interview questions, and then we also have ones that are culture-based. So we like to interview people to see if they're legit and if they're gritty and authentic and passionate and all of these things. And so we have specific questions that we've written that map to our values, and we will ask each interviewer to spend time on one section of our values, so everyone has a chance to interview against that. And one of the things that I coach people on, you had talked about taking notes in interviews. I still do this to this day, that if I have 3 very specific things that I need to ask someone, I'll come in with the interview questions. So we don't actually give them to interviewers as part of the prep. But I will suggest to them making sure that you know what you want to accomplish in the interview. And then as part of the building rapport, say, there are some really specific things that I would like to learn from you today. I hope you don't mind that I take notes, or I've actually brought in some questions that I want to ask you. I think sometimes there's this sense of, it being rude or awkward if you are reading from a notepad or taking notes. And it's really not at all. You just want to set the table for the person and help them understand why you're doing it or what you're doing.
And I think there's a fine line of balancing, how many notes I'm going to take versus I can imagine if I were in an interview and the interviewer wasn't taking any notes, I would be concerned that, are they actually capturing what I'm saying, and are they going to remember this conversation, and, how are they going to relay this back to the management team, et cetera. So I do think that I've seen that where there's fear of, well, if I take notes, they're going to think I'm not paying attention. I don't necessarily know that that's the case. I will caution people against using laptops unless necessary in the interview. I've heard
worst.
Yeah, exactly. People are looking down, and I've even heard folks do panel interviews where I apparently had said in the beginning, everyone's going to have their laptop out and they're taking notes, but the person forgot who the candidate. And at the end, they're like, it was so nerve-wracking because they were answering emails the entire time, so I felt like they weren't paying attention to what I was saying.
Oh, that's
It's just,
awful.
A horrible experience. So
I think it also creates a barrier too,
Exactly.
right? To have that screen up in between you and the person you're talking to.
Exactly. Yeah. Candidate experience, I think, is huge. And, you don't want to have to bring in another person because you had a bad candidate experience and that person dropped out of the process. So.
We say that all the time. Candidates are interviewing you just as much as you're interviewing them. And everything that you do, you are representing the company, you're representing the culture, the brand. And if you are not respectful towards the candidate, that's not only going to damage that individual experience, but the ripple effect of them going out and telling friends and family and strangers on Glassdoor, you name it, about what their experience was like is going to stay with you.
Cool. Well, we are creeping up on optimal podcast length. So I guess we can start wrapping up here. Kat, you're amazing. It was so awesome meeting you. You just blew my mind with all this stuff about recruiting training and sourcing training and hiring manager diplomacy and all that.
Well, both of you guys are amazing, and I'm super impressed with everything that you're doing at Intello. I mean, I think that I work with a lot of companies, and having manager training and interview training and all of these different things, communicating, leveling, I think all of it's awesome.
Thanks. Well,
thank you.
I loved meeting you, so we'll have to continue to talk shop.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, this has been a blast. Thank you for coming in. Come back anytime. And to all of you out there in podcast land, I've been Rob Stevenson. You've been amazing, wonderful, talented, beautiful recruiters. Have a spectacular week, and happy hunting.